Yeah, no worries. I will get my presentation up. Cool. All right. Yeah, thanks. So thanks for the invite, everyone. I'm originally from Exeter, New Hampshire, so it's nice to be able to give a talk to fellow New Englanders who I don't get to see as much anymore now that I live down in DC. So as Josh alluded to, I'm going to be talking about one of my dissertation chapters that focuses on the full annual cycle of American Redstarts, a bird that you guys probably all know very well. And before I get into details, I'm going to give you a quick background and roadmap of the talk. It's probably only going to take around 30 minutes, so not too long. I want to start off with sort of the justification for this project, namely that we're experiencing unprecedented bird declines and how migratory connectivity will help us solve those. I'll give some brief background about American Redstart, which I use as my study system. And then I'll talk a little bit about species distribution models, which is the second prong of this two-pronged project. I won't get into too much today, but I'll give you a quick background. Then I'll go into some methods about the fieldwork that I'm doing now, collecting tracking data for American Redstarts. And then I'll give you some Premier VIP exclusive access to some of the results that I'm getting this summer that no one besides me and my partner have seen. So you guys are getting extra special treatment. And then finally, I'll end with what I see as the impact of this project in the world as a whole. So without further ado, it probably won't come as a surprise to you guys that we're losing birds at an unprecedented rate. This paper, The Decline of the North American Avifauna, was put together by a bunch of big name ornithologists in North America back in 2019, and using citizen science data, so stuff like eBird, monitoring data like the Breeding Bird Survey, and radar data. They combined all those and showed that we've experienced a net loss of 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. And this should alarm us. And it's particularly alarming for migratory birds, because part of their results showed that migratory birds are showing the steepest declines out of bird groups in North America. And out of those migratory birds, shorebirds and warblers seem to be the steepest. And this is likely due to the fact that migratory birds experience a suite of different threats and obstacles as they move between stages of their full annual cycles. And to help illustrate that, just add a couple of pictures here. I'm sure it won't come to a surprise to you guys that deforestation can be very detrimental to migratory bird species, not only on their breeding grounds, but their wintering grounds, as well as their stopover areas. And at each of these different stages of their full annual cycle, they run into threats like feral cat predation. And they're constantly having to avoid obstacles that we humans like to put in front of them. This is a really moving photo of a black and white warbler that was killed by a building collision. And for those of you unfamiliar with this, during migration especially, migrating birds at night will be attracted to heavily lit areas like cities, and they're essentially blinded and will fly right into buildings and windows and die. And so with this constant suite of different threats and obstacles, migratory birds have been suffering. And there's really no way for us to pinpoint the exact threats or combination of threats without having an understanding of migratory connectivity for each of these migratory bird species. And migratory connectivity is basically a fancy way of saying the degree to which individuals from a population remain together throughout the stages of their full annual cycle. And to help illustrate migratory connectivity, I have two examples here of a species with lower migratory connectivity on the left, and then a species with higher migratory connectivity on the right. And if we start with the theoretical species on the left, we see that it has two breeding populations in Montana and Maine, and 2 non-breeding populations in Mexico and the Bahamas. And when it's time to migrate down, we see that the birds from Montana migrate in equal numbers to Mexico and the Bahamas, and the same is true for the breeding population in Maine. And so this species is an example of low migratory connectivity because we see that individuals from the same population are not necessarily remaining together as they move between stages of their full annual cycle. Whereas for the theoretical species on the right that has higher migratory connectivity, we see that the opposite is true. In this scenario, the Montana population, every single individual migrates down to Mexico, whereas every individual from the Maine population migrate down to the Bahamas. And you can imagine that the degree of migratory connectivity exhibited by a species will in turn determine how different threats scale up to affect the species-wide population. And just a good example of this recently are with Kirtland's warblers. So until like the last decade, pretty much, we didn't really know where the population of Kirtland warblers was wintering. And when we finally figured it out using tracking technology, scientists found that there are 2 islands in the Bahamas that host around 80% of the population of Kirtland's warblers. So we now know if habitat destruction were to occur on those islands in the Bahamas, it would have a disproportionate effect on the overall populations of Kirtland's warblers. Whereas if they wintered in a bunch of different locations, then that same deforestation event in the Bahamas wouldn't have as great of an effect. And so you can apply that example to pretty much every single threat you can think of. And as you start to think about it more, it becomes crazy to even try to assess a species conservation status without starting with that data on migratory connectivity. Unfortunately, these data are very scarce, and that's the reason that a lot of people ignore them. And it can be pretty overwhelming to find a place to start when there are so many species in decline and we simply don't have data on migratory connectivity for most of them. But a good place to start are with common species, like the American Redstart. Surprise, surprise. And so that's why I use American Redstarts as my focal study species for my investigation of migratory bird ecology and conservation. Among a suite of reasons, Redstarts are very well studied, so we have a suite of background knowledge on them already. They've been the focal species of my advisor's research program for the last 30 years. They have very high site fidelity, so the individuals will reliably come back to the same breeding and non-breeding grounds year after year after year. They're very easy to catch, making them a very good species for extrinsic markers, which include things like bands and tracking devices. And they also occupy a range of habitats, meaning they encounter a suite of different environmental conditions, allowing us to ask questions about how different abiotic and biotic factors are affecting populations of the species. And I've included this map on the right here. This is the Breeding Bird Survey population trend map for American Redstarts from 1970 to 2017. And you can see that Redstarts have pretty considerable variation in their regional population trends across their breeding range, where the dark blue areas indicate areas where the population is increasing, usually about 2% or more per year, whereas the bright red areas indicate the opposite, that populations are declining by about 2% or more per year. And then the more intermediate colors represent more intermediate trends. And if we hope to understand that variation in population trends and how those populations will change in the future over time, we need to know the migratory connectivity for American Redstarts. And luckily, this actually has been estimated for Redstarts before using stable isotope analysis. And just for the people who haven't heard of stable isotope analysis before, it's really, really interesting. Broadly, stable isotope analysis relies on different isotopic ratios of common elements like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, in order to deduce where an organism's tissue is grown which allows you to infer some sense of spatial location that that organism used. And so this was first used in criminology, where they'd find decomposing bodies and use stable isotope analysis to figure out where that person was before they died. For birds, a little bit less gruesome, we rely on plucking feather samples on the wintering grounds. And since we know feathers were grown after the post-breeding season molt, we know that if we pluck a feather from a bird on the wintering grounds and we run stable isotope analysis on that feather, we can get an estimate, a pretty coarse estimate, but an estimate nonetheless of that bird's breeding location. And specifically, we focus on hydrogen because hydrogen varies substantially with latitude. And so that was what was done for redstarts about 10 years ago now. And while that's very informative, unfortunately, stable isotope analysis is very coarse grain. So only get an idea of like very broad regions of breeding latitude, but we don't have any information on specific breeding sites, non-breeding sites, migratory routes taken by individuals. And importantly, we don't have any temporal aspect to the data. So we don't know how much time the birds spent on the breeding grounds during migration and on the wintering grounds. And so we really need data on migratory connectivity with a finer resolution if we're going to have a chance at understanding how these populations are going to change over time. And once we have those data, we can use species distribution models to actually make these estimates of how the redstart populations will change with time. And so these species distribution models are pretty much the most popular tool used to answer these sorts of questions. They become popular over the last 20, 15 years or so as our quantitative methods have improved drastically. And basically they help us predict a species spatiotemporal response to some combination of biotic and abiotic factors. Usually this combination of factors is just precipitation and temperature because those data are widely available. And usually the question in hand is how species are going to respond to climate change. And so temperature and precipitation is a proxy for that. And that's exactly what was done in this example map that I'm showing you here, done by the Audubon Society for, I think, 100 common species in North America. And so what this type of SDM does, and what many of the other SDMs applied for birds do, is rely on abiotic, temperature, precipitation variables from the breeding grounds. And you've probably heard me say full annual cycle enough times in this talk so far that you have a sense of where I'm going with this. And I want to kind of pose a rhetorical leading question to you now. Do you think these breeding season focused SDMs are actually useful for migratory birds that only spend 3 months of their annual cycle on the breeding grounds? I say, I don't think they're very useful, and we need full annual cycle species distribution models. And we need them now if we're going to get a tool that actually gives us accurate predictions about how these populations will change over time. And to really nail home this point, I want to quote the late evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who is famous for saying, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And for the purposes of this talk, I want to slightly rephrase that to help nail home this point that I want to make. Nothing in migratory bird ecology makes sense except in the light of migratory connectivity. And if you leave tonight only remembering that quote, then I have done my job because I have ingrained you in the full annual cycle doctrine. So for this two-pronged project, I wanted to first collect that fine resolution data on migratory connectivity for my study species, the American Redstart, and then use that tracking data to develop this full annual cycle SDM I keep hyping up. And then I want to compare the predictive performance between the full annual cycle SDM to the breeding season only SDM. Of course, I'm hypothesizing that the SDMs will differ their inability to predict changes in redstart distributions over time. And I'm predicting that the full annual cycle SDM will do this better because it incorporates information from the full annual cycle rather than just the breeding season. And so in order to collect this tracking data that I keep talking about, I had to set up a way to get out and sample populations across the range of the redstarts and deploy tracking devices. And so this map that you're looking at in the middle of the slide shows the redstart breeding range divided up into natural populations. And a natural population simply refers to a subpopulation of a species that occupy the same habitat type and are experiencing the same population trend. And so if you guys are familiar with bird conservation regions, that's very similar to what this map is showing. And so you'll see there are a bunch of these natural populations, color-coded. And as much as I wanted to go and sample all of them, I had limited funding and limited time. I needed to get these tracking devices all out in one summer. And I could only afford 80 geolocators total. Geolocators are a tracking device, which I'll explain in the next slide. And so I landed on these 4 populations. And I set out last summer, and at each of these populations, I deployed 20 geolocators. So that means 20 redstarts, more or less, got a geolocator on their back. And now this summer, I'm going to each of those 4 populations, and I'm looking around trying to find the redstarts that came back, and I'm trying to recapture them, take the geolocator, and use the resulting data to determine the migratory routes they take, their wintering locations, and overall the species migratory connectivity. And so you guys may have heard of geolocators, you may not have. Regardless, I'm just going to give a quick background because I think they're super, super interesting. Basically, geolocators are tracking devices that rely on solar geolocation, which is a process that people much smarter than me figured out many centuries ago, where you can calculate spatial locations using day length, which is a proxy for latitude, and solar noon, which is a proxy for longitude. In other words, if you have light data, you can get a pretty good estimate of spatial location. And so this is exactly what the geolocators do. They're archival data loggers, which means the data is stored and not transmitted. And they have a little light sensor, which you can kind of see right here poking out, that record light data. And so every day that the geolocator is on the bird's back, you get light data and you can figure out where that bird was on that particular day, which I think is amazing, especially considering how small these geolocators are. This little device weighs 0.28 grams with the harness attached, which is amazing and is really the only way for us to get data on migratory connectivity for these small songbirds like American redstarts. You know, redstarts weigh 8 grams and simply could not support the higher tech satellite transmitters that you see people using with groups of birds like albatross and raptors. And so you attach the geolocator to the redstart by attaching the geolocator first to this harness, which I call a figure-8 harness. And this harness is actually relatively new. People used to use leg loop harnesses, where instead of the figure-8 shape, you'd have the same material, making like a kind of half moon D on either side. And what this harness does better is the geolocator rests on top of the knot in the figure-8, which allows it to sit slightly higher on the bird's back. And so this is particularly important during the post-breeding season molt, where all the birds molt their feathers and grow new ones. And so by the geolocator sitting on top of the knot of the harness, it prevents the new feathers from growing over the geolocator and obscuring the light sensor. And obviously we don't want to obscure the light sensor because that would totally screw up our data. But I think these things are fascinating. And they're really easy to attach the bird. Once the geo is on the harness, you wrap these little leg loops around the bird's legs, and then the geolocator rests very nicely on the bird's back. And so after all my fun field work, I'll theoretically have lots of data, and I'll be able to integrate that spatiotemporal data into a full annual cycle species distribution modeling framework. And as much as I know you guys want to hear me talk about stats and math and models, I'm actually going to not do that today because I don't think I have the mental bandwidth to be able to do that. Instead, I'm going to show you something way more exciting. We're going to take that, what I promised, the peek into the results so far. So like I said, this is VIP premier exclusive, never before seen results that only my partner and I have seen so far. So you guys are seeing hot off the press data. And I've chosen one of the typical New Hampshire bird tracks. And so just to give you a brief update on where I am in the field season now, I've visited my Maryland and New Hampshire sites, and I'm now in Wisconsin, just starting out here. And so out of all the New Hampshire birds, this is kind of like what the stereotypical track looked like. And I'm just gonna break this down step by step, just so you guys get to experience all the joy that I got to experience when I first saw this. What we're looking at is the track of this one individual redstart throughout the full year, which was from the end of May 2021 until the end of May this year, 2022, so a full year. And each one of these points represents one day. And so where there are lots of points overlapped, like down here, it's hard to see, but this is actually like 90 points. And each point is color coded based on the month. And so starting up here, we have the New Hampshire site where I first caught the birds. So this is Pawtuckaway State Park in Rockingham County in New Hampshire. We see that these green points up here represent summer. And we see the lighter green represent August. And then we see the bird work its way up into Canada in late summer, which is something I was not expecting, and I can only explain as some sort of staging event, because the redstarts usually wrap up breeding and maintaining their territories usually by the end of July. And so they have this whole month of August where they're not migrating yet, where they basically have freedom to roam wherever. And there's some literature on this recently about these post-breeding movements. Some people think they could be prospecting movements where a redstart might be like checking out other suitable habitats that it could return to the following year. God forbid something happened to its existing breeding territory. But it could also be as simple as there's simply no reason for the redstart to stay at its breeding site because it no longer needs to defend a territory. All it needs to focus on now is getting ready for that fall migration. And so whatever the reason is, this bird had a nice summer vacation up into Canada. And then we see the yellow and the orange start to come in, which represents September and October. And this is where we see fall migration really occurring, where the bird moves down back through New England and seems to have another staging stop here in Rhode Island, New York, before moving south, another quick staging visit in North Carolina, and then this big transocean crossing to the Bahamas, down into the Dominican Republic, and then another big crossing down into Venezuela. And then we see the red turn into blue, and that is when it's wintering. So this is December, January, February. And it's hard to see in this map, but you can kind of see there's a little heat cloud here, which estimates the core region of this particular bird's non-breeding territory. And so it looks like that was right on the coast of Venezuela. So chances are this redstart got to spend its whole winter chilling in mangroves, eating insects, just living the dream. It really sounds nice. But we all get stuck with the New England winter. Seems fair, but they did the work for it, so maybe it is fair. And then in late winter, we see another sort of interesting movement away from its core non-breeding territory down into southern Venezuela. And some of this movement is error just from the geolocation. There's a standard error of these points of about Usually it's about 100 kilometers, but this is enough of a movement that this is more than just air. This is the bird moving south. And so this is some other example of some sort of pre-migratory movement strategy, some kind of staging strategy probably. And it could be that the redstart is following tropical pulses of resources, which we know are, everywhere in the tropics and can be quite heterogeneous. And so it's possible that maybe it got really dry in March and then it needed to kind of move into these mountains here. I think this is called the Cerro Andino in Venezuela to get more resources. But whatever it is, it did this interesting movement and then we turn into the green dots. And so now we're in April. And we see this is when the spring migration begins. The redstart makes its way back up, leaves Venezuela, crosses back into the Dominican Republic, up into Florida, and now we're in May. And overall, it takes the redstart about 2 weeks to get back up to Pawtuckaway State Park, where I was waiting with my mist net and a grin on my face. And so this is all really exciting, and I want to make sure we go through all the major takeaways. First and foremost, I just want to comment on how amazing it is that this little 8-grain songbird is able to make this sort of movement every year that it's alive. We're talking 2,000 kilometers migration distance. These trans-ocean movements are insane. This bird does it in a day. Are you kidding me? So be inspired, because these are inspiring birds. And now the more scientific takeaways are first and foremost that there's some sort of post-breeding movement going on in Canada that we need to look into more. We need to figure out why the birds are doing this, if it's significant, if that ends up affecting its fall migration. And the same is true for that pre-spring migration movement we see down in Venezuela. Why are these birds doing it? Is this something to do with the winter territory not retaining its quality? Is it simply Zuganruhi taking over and driving the bird whatever direction? It honestly, this is what happens with science, is you figure something out and then it creates 1,000 more questions, but that's the goal, so we're happy about it. And then we also learned for the first time that these birds are wintering in coastal Venezuela. And this is something that the stable isotope data would have never been able to tell us. The stable isotope data maybe could have told us that, the broad region where a bird was wintering or breeding, but not this fine scale resolution of spatial data, which is really useful because we can start to figure out, all right, let's look at the abiotic factors like precipitation and temperature. Let's look at the biotic factors at this area in Venezuela and see if there's some sort of limiting factor there that's scaling up to affect this New England population of redstarts. And on that same vein, we see with the migratory routes that this redstart, as well as the other New Hampshire redstarts I got tracking data for, use Dominican Republic as a stopover for both their fall and spring migration. And so it's very possible that this could act as a bottleneck for this population during bad years, and it could in the future as well. Because if all these New Hampshire individuals are relying on that stopover habitat being high quality enough to be able to land there safely and then take off the next day or the next few days, if something were to happen there, they'd be screwed because they're just coming off of these huge energetically costly flights on both ends, whether it's fall or spring migration. So that's something important to keep a lookout for. And knowing this, it's also possible that the birds that didn't come back may have also had a similarly bottlenecked stopover area that was deforested or that did have some threat. And that's why they didn't come back, because they suffered mortality. And we know mortality for songbirds is highest during migration. And so it's very possible that if these birds are really relying on the same stopover for both fall and spring migration, it could have catastrophic consequences for that regional breeding population. And so overall, I just wanted to kind of summarize the impact that I think this work will have on the conservation field as well as the more migratory bird ecology field. And so I think the tracking data in particular is very important for the migratory bird conservation field because we simply do not have these data on migratory connectivity for a lot of the species we're seeing the steepest declines in. And so moving forward, I hope this sort of study can act as a framework for whatever organization to collect similar spatiotemporal data on other migratory bird species, whether it be a government implementing some long-term tracking program on a refuge, or an NGO like the World Wildlife Fund or Audubon Society funding tracking projects, or academic research programs investing a lot of time into kind of answering the questions that stem off of these spatiotemporal data. And no matter what the reason is, we need to take this step towards collecting more tracking data, because without the tracking data, we don't have the building blocks we need to really understand the conservation status for each one of these imperiled migratory bird species. And I didn't get into the second prong of my project on the full annual cycle species distribution models, but it will be an advance in that field as well, because no previous SDM has ever attempted to integrate any sort of data on migratory connectivity, meaning they've lost out on a lot of the processes that occur across the full annual cycle and not just the breeding season. A great example of this, which is something my lab has studied for a while now, are seasonal carryover effects. And we've shown in a long-term study site in Jamaica that during dry years, those effects of drought carry over into the breeding season. We see that during dry years, redstarts depart their wintering grounds later. They arrive at the breeding grounds later. They have reduced breeding success. They have increased mortality. And so we know that drought is a factor that really influences the regional population dynamics for wherever those redstarts go. And so we really need to take this next step in the species distribution modeling framework to add that data from the full annual cycle, to add that tracking data. Because if we don't, we're never going to be able to accurately predict how these migratory species are going to respond to future climate change. And with that, I will take any and all of your questions. Thanks for listening, guys.
All right, thank you, Henry. Very interesting stuff. And the questions are starting to stack up in the chat column here. And I have a couple too, but I'll save mine and read the ones from the rest of the audience first. So let's see. First off, first question goes, from the early map on increases and decreases in regions in North America, it gave the impression that redstarts are increasing mainly in the central plains states. And in those states, we'd expect, there are more grasslands and less of the forests that are typical redstart habitat. And the forests being maybe more fragmented or more reduced. So do you have any insight on why redstarts would be increasing in that part of the country where we might look at them and expect them, based on what we know of the habitat, to be decreasing?
Yeah, so there are two hypotheses I have for this. The first is that the wintering locations for these Midwest populations of redstarts are particularly high quality, and maybe we're not seeing the same drought that we are in other regions like the Caribbean. The second hypothesis, and they're not mutually exclusive, is that I believe there's a lot of forest reclamation occurring in this Great Plains area where the deciduous forests that redstarts like are encroaching on area that has historically been the Great Plains. And so redstarts really like that kind of secondary successional forest. And so that could be, it could be as simple as, with this forest reclamation, there's simply more suitable habitat, more suitable breeding territories for these redstarts. And so that reduces intraspecific competition. More redstarts can easily defend high quality territories, which means they can more easily fledge young. And it's likely that it's probably a combination of both, where there's more forest reclamation in this Midwest region, so redstarts are moving in, and the wintering grounds are suitable enough that they're not experiencing mass mortality during that stage of the full annual cycle either.
Excuse me if I missed it. Do you have data yet on where the wintering grounds are for that particular population, or is that still coming?
I'm in Wisconsin now, just a couple of days in, so that's still coming. But we think it's like Jamaica or Cuba.
Okay, interesting. All right, next question in line. This one's more of a compliment than a question, but saying, interesting mapping of the New Hampshire bird. Don't blame me for being excited about this information. Look forward to hearing about what you gather this summer at your other sites. Your enthusiasm is infectious. All right, then next actual question. How much does weather, and you kind of touched on this with your comments about drought, how does weather account for increases or decreases in an area? This spring we had more north winds in early May that kept migrants away from us this year. Would a redstart that bred in New England one year breed in the Midwest a different year because of weather conditions, or will it always return to the same breeding area? Which I know that is true with monarch butterflies, that weather conditions will cause them to breed in different areas from year to year. But what about with redstarts?
Redstarts, they have super high site fidelity. It's one of the reasons I chose them as a study species. So even if like they lose their previous breeding site or weather kind of like leads them astray, they'll bounce back and they'll find somewhere as close as possible to where they are used to breeding. But no like major dispersal events to other regions.
Excellent. All right, next up, what was the sample size of birds recovered in New Hampshire after a complete annual cycle? How sure are you that the New Hampshire birds you recover are following a path more general or typical of all New Hampshire birds?
Good question. The recovery rate for New Hampshire was 6 out of 18, so 33%, which is pretty average. And yeah, for the second question, I can't be sure. A key part of working with geolocators is recognizing that you only catch the birds that survived. And so the birds that I didn't get back, maybe the reason they didn't come back was because they took another route. But yeah, we don't really have any other information than the ones we get back, so that's what I'm working with. But it's totally possible that the ones that didn't make it back took other routes and that's why they died. However, I'd expect that the routes will be pretty similar, just based on what we know about like high site fidelity, and the stable isotope analysis for migratory connectivity showed redstarts have moderate to moderate high migratory connectivity, meaning that a large proportion of the population is going to go to the same non-breeding area and vice versa.
All right, and your recovery rate of about 1/3 of the birds that you put devices on, how does that compare to like people who have studied using just like banding or other methods in terms of kind of site fidelity measurements and the percentage of birds that come back? Are they get a similar about 1/3 rate?
Well, it's hard to know for redstarts on the breeding grounds because as far as I know, there haven't been any just color band studies. But before this study, our lab did a pilot study in Jamaica where they put 10 geolocators and color bands on redstarts and then only color bands on 10 other ones, and the return rate was the same. And that one, they both had a return rate of 0.5, so half the birds came back. So for whatever reason, maybe that site's particularly good, or maybe there is just more manpower to recite birds. But yeah, so we know from that pilot study that there doesn't seem to be an effect of the geolocators on the birds' return rates. But we don't know, it's just hard to know how that non-breeding ground comparison scales up to the breeding ground comparison, because on the wintering grounds, they're very densely packed where, territories can be like a quarter of a hectare, like ridiculously small, whereas in the breeding grounds, redstart territories are much bigger. So yeah, it's hard
I was
to
just
say.
going to ask whether the way like with birds that go up into Canada for breeding, the available kind of square mileage of breeding habitat is often much greater than what they can spread out to in the winter. And I was wondering if that was the case, where it's just the amount of space they have to spread out in the breeding zone.
I think that's definitely part of it. And I bet my return rate would be higher if I had the manpower to do like a 1 mile buffer outside of my study sites. Because I just have a feeling that there are birds that, bred within my study site and then maybe came back and chose a territory like one over outside my study site. And so I just have like no way of knowing if they came back or not. Whereas on the wintering grounds, it's okay if they move territories because they're only moving a quarter of a hectare, which is, barely anything.
All right. Let's see. And then we have another compliment. Fantastic talk, fascinating and thought-provoking.
Thank you.
And then the next question, am I right in thinking that redstarts segregate by sex in their winter habitats? And could some of the results you're getting in your study be the result of differences in timing and location of males versus females?
Yeah, so my advisor actually wrote the paper that showed that. So on the wintering grounds, dominant adult males will get the wetter, high quality habitat, whereas females and juvenile redstarts get downgraded to more scrubby, dry habitat. For this study, I only captured and tagged adult males. So we know that the habitat part should be consistent.
Okay, even like from year to year, like as the males go from say 3 years old to 5 years old to 7, it still stays pretty steady.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. With big, easily seen birds like egrets, post-breeding dispersal can be obvious if when they move north of their breeding range. Could post-breeding dispersal like this be more common than we think in small, in warblers and other smaller birds that don't draw as much attention as the big waders?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it's super common, and it's probably the norm, not the exception. And we're just starting to figure out that with the tracking data, which is another reason it's so important.
Very good. Let's see. All right, next up. Hi, Henry. Do you have any role model species where the full annual cycle research has led to better conversation?
Yeah, Kirtland's warbler. They went from critically endangered and now they're thinking about taking them off the list because we figured out where they're wintering and we also figured out how to manage jack pine. And so that's like the ultimate full annual cycle integration and conservation story, which is easy. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but it's easier for a species like the Kirtland's warbler, where they have a very restricted range versus something like a redstart where there's so many moving parts to manage. But yeah, Kirtland's warbler is definitely the inspiration story.
Now, a lot of us from, a lot of birders from this part of the world have been to Michigan and seen the Kirtlands there and seen like what's being done with the jack pine habitat you mentioned. What's going on in their wintering range now that it's better known? Are there steps being taken about their wintering habitat that's bringing about improvements down there?
I'm not actually sure what's going on right now. I think once they identified the important areas, there was maybe some conservation attention, but yeah, I'm not an expert on it, so I'd have to look it up.
Okay. Nobody can be an expert on everything. So, all right. Next question, last one currently in the chat. So anyone out there who's sitting on a question and hasn't posted it yet or asked it yet, get ready to ask. But the last one's posted in the chat window for now. Have you studied other migratory birds like chimney swifts roosting in chimneys? Is this part of migration or the end of a migratory route? Oh, and this is in relation to a specific ongoing situation here in Massachusetts. So, so do you know anything about, speaking of whether you know everything about everything, what do you know about chimney swift migration patterns and use of chimneys and how that fits in?
I know people have tracked chimney swifts with geolocators. I'm pretty sure there was a paper where someone did that. And that's the extent of what I know. I don't know like anything off the top of my head about their migratory routes. But I'd assume that if there's chimney swifts like roosting for more than 2 days in someone's chimney, then it's that's like their breeding site.
Okay, Bruce, I saw you kind of gesturing there. Did you have something to add to the question beyond what I read off?
Well, if you wanted, I decided to throw in that this chimney is being taken down in Williamsburg at an old school for a public safety complex. And so I'm trying to work around that somehow, either by building a tower, if they'd allow a tower, and understanding more of where the swifts are. Like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had 42 to 45 roosting there. Now it's down to 23. And I don't know whether they're moving on, whether they're moving into their new nesting habitats and other chimneys, which maybe take one. I've heard possibly 2, possibly only 1 pair, but just more details on that. Even if anyone else has it, I'm trying to gain more knowledge about this.
I'm
how
sure
to deal with this situation.
I'm sure I could fish around trying to find a speaker for September who's done research in that area. So
cool, great.
I don't have that. I don't have the fall speakers nailed down yet. So
okay,
I'll keep that in mind. Thank you, Bruce. So
thank you,
Henry. I guess I had a question or two I wanted to throw in. You mentioned that so the Redstarts had very high site fidelity as and then you're studying connectivity. Do you think there'd be a relationship between the two, where a bird with high connectivity would also have high site fidelity, or vice versa? What do you think?
There could be, but I wouldn't say high site fidelity is an indicator of high migratory connectivity. It simply could be the fact that all Redstarts have high site fidelity to their breeding and non-breeding sites, but they just don't move together. And so if they don't move together between stages of the annual cycle, then it would be low connectivity, despite them having high site fidelity.
Okay, interesting. What about my other question kind of in, if you've got high connectivity in, within populations, kind of in a short-term kind of temporal view, if you look over longer spans of time, would that change the potential for speciation between populations if there was higher or lower migratory connectivity in a short term?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. So there's really two options in my mind. If it has option one, high connectivity lets species become more adapted to their environment. And this is kind of was my first hypothesis when I first saw and started really looking at the breeding range map for redstarts, because there are breeding populations in British Columbia that have to insulate their nests from snow in June. And then there are also breeding populations of redstarts that nest in the swamps of Louisiana. And so you'd expect that over time, they'd probably diverge because those are pretty different environmental stressors that they have to deal with. And so hypothesis one is that high connectivity leads to faster adaptation, faster speciation. Hypothesis two is that the lack of gene flow makes these populations more susceptible to being wiped out by rapidly changing climate change, because they have just less genetic material to adapt to perhaps unpredictable environmental change, which we know could be the case with climate change in the relatively near future. And so, yeah, it can go either way. It's something I've really wanted to kind of address, but it's a tough question to be able to answer in a satisfactory way.
Right. Well, you're heading in that direction at least then. So
Hopefully.
we're glad that somebody is. I guess unless we have any more questions out there, it looks like the flow of new ones has slowed down. So I think we will say thank you, Henry, for a very interesting talk. It was a very nice. We'll look forward to maybe having you back in a few years to get an update and see what you learned between now and then.
Yeah, I can show you guys the full map. Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening and all the good questions, and yeah, being engaged. It was great to be here.
Okay, we'd have a standing ovation for you if this was a talk in person.
It's all right. Sitting ovations will do fine.
You just have to read the chat window. All the thanks and compliments are flowing.
Yeah.
I will turn off the recording now. So